The jobs report just came out indicating that we lost 92,000 jobs in February, which is one of the worst reports we've had in years. Now, I'm going to talk also about the ADP jobs report that came out earlier this week because it had some contrasting information in terms of it had a little bit rosier projections for the economy in terms of what their data was showing. I'm also going to talk about what the implications are for the economy, although on the surface, unemployment going up as well as the jobs report coming in with these job losses would be bad news. But I'm going to tell you why the market will probably look at it as good news, as well as the housing market, because of what this means for the Federal Reserve and their approach to interest rates and how interest rates will affect the current easing cycle that we're in. Now, I have a few articles pulled up for you that we'll review, but first, let's just dive into the data. So what exactly happened in today's jobs report? Well, we lost 92,000 jobs total, and the unemployment rate ticked up slightly from 4.3% to 4.4%. Now, where this comes in sharp contrast with what happened the month before is what plays a key role in this data, because you see the month earlier, the jobs report from January that we got from the BLS is showing that we actually added 126,000 jobs in January. So for it to go into negative territory where we just lost 92,000 jobs, that's a huge reversal compared to the report that we just got in January and basically wiped out all those job gains that we saw in that report. Now, the elephant in the room I want to talk about first is the healthcare jobs. If you're not aware, there's currently several healthcare strikes, and 28,000 jobs that were reported in that $92,000 job loss were from healthcare. And so part of it's related to the strike. If you pull those out, we're still looking at 64,000 jobs roughly lost. And so that's a big number for people to deal with and for the economy to deal with. We had 12,000 jobs that were lost in manufacturing, and we had another 11,000 jobs lost in construction. So hospitality, or restaurants and bars, accounted for 30,000 job losses. So this is jobs like UPS, for example. They had 17,000 job losses. So basically, where does this place us in the economy? Well, if we look at the economy as a whole, stock market is still near all-time highs. Even though unemployment ticked up to 4.4%, it's still relatively low. However, here's the thing that a lot of people forget about unemployment data. And if you look at data like this, it explains why the Federal Reserve is always late to the party when it comes to lowering interest rates on time or raising interest rates on time, because they look at lagging indicators as leading indicators in order to determine whether or not they should raise rates or lower rates. And what I mean by that is unemployment is a lagging indicator, and oftentimes it takes months, if not years, for them to get accurate data. In 2008, Bernanke was quoted saying that, oh, it's not going to be that bad of a recession. Right now, nothing's changed. They keep doing the same thing. They keep using BLS data, or these job reports, as part of the indicators of what they need to do with rates. But the problem is that by the time the data updates and shows that we're in recession, or we have very high inflation, or we have a very tight job market, those are lagging indicators. They don't actually show you what's happening right away. It takes several months, if not years, for things to accurately be accounted for. And this data is just another example of that. But that being said, how do we use this information to know what's going to happen next in the economy? Well, first, let's start with what happened today, this morning. At the opening bell, the stock market was down on bad news, which is that unemployment ticked up, as well as the jobs report reporting 92,000 lost jobs, which was a stark contrast from January. And so a little bit of a sell-off is expected. However, sometimes the market, as it has happened in the past, has reacted to this as good news. And the reason is because it looks at lowering rates, which means an increase in liquidity and possibly quantitative easing. Because anytime we have troubling economic data or unemployment data, I'm looking at this data is, okay, what does this data mean to the markets? What does this data actually mean is going on in the economy? And what does this data actually mean for the housing market? And how can you use this information to make money, right? Well, the Fed is, in my opinion, now likely to lower rates a lot. You're going to see this start to be priced into the markets, where people are betting on a rate cut at the Fed's next meeting. And the reason that that's likely is obviously because, the Fed has two major goals, right? Number one is price stability. And price stability is just another word for, keeping inflation low. And number two is maximizing employment, or rather minimizing unemployment. So when the job market starts to show signs that it's cracking and that hiring is weak and the economy is softening, they react by stimulating and lowering rates, because that creates more stimulus in the economy because it lowers interest rates, and therefore it makes financing cheaper for businesses. It makes financing cheaper for houses, which I'll talk about what the implications are on the housing market for it going into 2026. But the bottom line is that this is both bad news and good news. Bottom line is it's been looking like we have a K-shaped economy for several years. Now, a K-shaped economy means top half of earners are spending all the money, bottom half are not spending any money, or the majority of spending in our consumption-based economy, meaning people buying things, is coming from the top 10% of earners, and everyone else is struggling and feeling it. And this jobs report kind of shows that there's some signs that the economy is starting to crack even for those upper income earners, because if upper income earners stop spending, right? If we lose more jobs and these higher earners stop spending because of uncertainty in the economy, which we're already seeing in sentiment reports that are showing up, in addition to jobs reports like this, where we're showing cracks in the labor market, although this will lower interest rates and makes homes affordable or more affordable because interest rates are coming down, what I think you're going to see is if those layoffs start to lead to people needing to sell their homes because you have forced selling because someone gets laid off. Anytime the median is affected by things like an increase in unemployment or an increase in likelihood of layoffs, that can then trickle in and affect people who are purchasing in luxury markets or higher end markets, just because it affects people's ability to buy and sell homes. And so, although it is going to be a great time to buy, I see us going into 2026 maintaining a solid buyer's market in most markets. Now, if you look at my rent versus buy video that I made, which is kind of one of the age-old equations that's used to determine whether or not it makes more sense to buy a home, is whether it's cheaper to rent versus buy. If you're in a high-end luxury market or a very high demand market like New York City, the rent to buy equation it'll always be cheaper to rent typically. It's rarely cheaper to actually buy in these markets. But the bottom line is the rent versus buy scenario is an age-old equation that's used to determine whether or not it makes sense to rent or buy. And it also gives you a little bit of an indicator of what's happening in the market. A lot of times at the top of a bubble, what you'll see, like we saw in 2022 and 2023, is that mortgage payments were substantially higher, 40, 50, 60% higher than rent payments. And that's especially true in the Denver metro because we had homes that were $800,000 that when interest rates went from 3.5% to 7% plus, that mortgage went up to where now renting that same $800,000 house would be $2,000 less or 50% less than what it would cost to buy because rates were so high. This is going to make it easier for sellers to sell, potentially a lot easier for buyers to buy, because if we get rates coming down even another half a point or more going into the summer, we're going to see that directly impact housing affordability in a lot of metros that are still softening. That buying activity will be tempered by the labor market. So if there's high unemployment, especially regionally, when you look at states like Nevada, typically Las Vegas, because it's a big employment center, typically they have higher unemployment, or unemployment hits there sooner than it does in other markets. And so when you see unemployment start to tick up, that's going to affect the amount of buyers in the buyer pool, even though interest rates might be lower and things might finally be more affordable. If people aren't in a position to buy, or they don't have employment, or they can't qualify for a loan, that's definitely going to affect them. And then if we look at sellers, what happens is if more sellers come into the market, like they have been over the past 3 years, consistently every single year going into the home buying season, which varies by market, but most of the time the home buying season is in the summer for most areas, except in really hot climates. Ironically, it kind of switches because people don't like it as much. Summer die off. But my whole point is that if we get another year of record inventory and we couple that with buying activity, then we'll have a little bit more of a balanced market, but it'll still be a solid buyer's market. We're still going to see a little bit of price softening. And then that will, if we don't have unemployment continue to tick up, where we have massive layoffs or a massive softening in the economy, which could be indicative that we're headed towards recession. If we can avoid that, then those will be kind of the things that we need to look out for. And in fact, I think we're starting to see the trough of the market. Things started to peak in terms of housing. In 2022 was the actual peak, and things didn't start really softening until the following summer in 2023. And so we're about 2 to 3 years into a softening cycle, and typically those cycles last 4 to 5 years before they trough out. And I think that's where we are right now, where we're starting to bottom out. And we'll bottom out going into all of 2026 into 2027. And then we'll see prices start to stabilize and then start to see a return to normalcy or moderate price appreciation, assuming we don't get a massive recession that throws a monkey wrench in everything. So that's what the current report that came out today says. But this is the thing, is that it doesn't tell the whole story, because earlier this week, like I said, we had a jobs report from ADP that had conflicting data. And let's take a look at what this jobs report from ADP said. Now, just earlier this week, ADP reported private companies added 63,000 jobs in February, and January's revised estimate showed that they just had 11,000 additions. Now, this is ADP's own data. This has nothing to do with the Bureau of Labor Statistics. This is from ADP's payroll reports, and this is how they compile this data. But it shows that they added 63,000 workers in February, which was an improvement from the 11,000 that they had in their data in January. And most of the hiring came in two sectors, which was health services as well as construction. Other sectors were flat or lower. Now let's talk about what this data means and why there's such a big discrepancy between ADP and the BLS. Now, there's always a discrepancy between private sector data and public sector data, or between, private companies like ADP and the jobs report, which comes from the government. Now, when the government produces a report, sometimes, this is just my opinion, it seems like these reports are very rosy and they're skewed to look good and look a certain way. And I don't know if there's political pressure because of midterm elections that are coming up, but it seems like there's often revisions with bad news that come later. So this week, I was particularly surprised when I saw ADP come out with positive data, and then I was expecting more positive data from the labor report that was coming from BLS this morning. But when we didn't get that, what it made me think was that we're headed for more trouble in the economy, because once the government is saying things are bad or headed in a negative direction, typically that's the start of bad news. Normally, like I said, they like to come out with rosy projections and then revise their data downwards. And honestly, their data is the most unreliable data. So when you're looking at this data, this is the bottom line in terms of how you use this information to make money. Because if you're taking the data at face value and saying, oh, this is what's actually happening in the economy, that's the wrong way to go about it. I don't trust any of this data, whether it's, I trust ADP's data more than I trust the government's data, but I don't trust any of it because of the massive amounts of revisions we always get. Anytime they come out with a jobs report, there's always revisions later. And so these numbers will be revised, but what you can use this for is a short-term outlook on what's going to happen in the economy in the next 3 to 6 months, and especially what's going to happen in the market in the next week to 2 weeks. To me, what it's looking like is, generally speaking, good news for the sake of interest rates, because this might be the nudge that the Fed needs, especially with Kevin Warsh coming into the equation. And so with a new Fed chair coming into the picture that will be a little bit more dovish, allegedly, but still likes to let the economy do its thing. He was on the board in 2008 during that crash, and he's been quoted saying in the past that he likes to let things play out, so to speak, meaning limited government involvement or limited involvement from the Fed interacting or intervening with interest rates. He believes they're just there to prevent catastrophes. But this data that's come out is likely to nudge the Fed to lower interest rates at the next meeting or at one of the next few meetings. Hopefully it's enough to push things in the right direction, because every little bit that interest rates come down makes housing more affordable for buyers trying to get in, which makes it easier for sellers to sell. And all in all, from a real estate perspective, it contributes to a little bit more balanced market and allows a lot of sectors, especially housing, to become more affordable. And so the bottom line is this: if you're in the market to buy or sell real estate, especially in the next 6 to 12 months, and this is what you're planning on doing, this is good news. Even though it might seem like bad news, because, we're having some pain in the economy in the sense that we had some job losses and we had unemployment tick up. It's actually good news because we're going to see rates start to come down. And number two is, the truth is, if you are concerned about your job, one of the best things you can do during times like this is start to brush up your resume. And especially if you're not sold on the particular position that you're at or the company that you're at currently, just getting things ready or being proactive to see what else is out there. Now's a good time to do that, especially because there are other jobs out there. But depending on your sector, there's a lot of construction jobs. So if you work in construction, if you work in the trades, or if you work in healthcare, especially because of the strikes, you're probably in good shape. Whereas some of the other sectors where a lot of jobs are being replaced by AI, now might be the time to start looking for ways that you can bulletproof your position or make yourself indispensable. So that way you're less likely to experience a layoff, and you're more likely to be in a good financial position going through the softening that we're in, because this is a great time to take advantage of cheap real estate, cheap assets, especially if we see pain in the markets as a result of this. So I hope you found this content helpful, and if you did, please hit the like button and consider subscribing. And as promised earlier, there's a video popping up on the screen right now that talks about renting versus buying and gives you some real world examples of how that plays out, so you can use that information to make money. So make sure you check that out if you haven't already. And as always, if you happen to be in the market to buy or sell real estate, or you'd like to invest with me in one of our projects, there's a link in the description on how you can get in touch, and we'll catch you on the next one.